The greatest thought that a man can have is what he thinks about God. I think he's right about that. I don't think we can have a higher thought than God. And what we think about Him matters. What we think about Him is of eternal importance. You know, if we get that right, then the rest of life will fall into place. But if we get that wrong, life is going to be a mess. We have to get God right. We have to understand His nature. We have to understand who He is and what He desires of us. Have you ever had on a dress shirt kind of like I do today, and you start buttoning that shirt? What happens if you get the first button wrong? Well, it's not going to work out right. Every other button after that's going to be wrong. But if you get the first one right, things work the way they're supposed to work. And so we have to get God right, and we have to get our thinking right about God. You know, Jesus talked about that in Matthew chapter 22. If you want to open your Bibles there, Jesus was talking with some individuals who had come to ask Him a question, not because they wanted to know, but because they wanted to stump Him. They wanted to silence Him. But they are the ones that are going to be silenced because they come and ask Him a question that their rabbis can't answer or have great difficulty answering, and Jesus answers it with ease. And then Jesus asked them a question. What do you think of the Christ? Whose son is He? It's interesting that they gave the right answer. They said the son of David, but they did not understand the full implications of that. Because He's not only the son of David, He's also the Lord of David. And they did not make that application. And so when He said, why then did David call Him Lord? They didn't know how to answer, they didn't want to answer, and they didn't ask Him any more questions. What we think about Jesus matters. What we think about Jesus is extremely important. And if we get that right, then life works out. If we don't, then life is not going to work. And certainly eternity is not going to work unless we get that right. You know, as a child of God, the sovereignty of God is very comforting to me. It's very comforting for me to know that my God is in charge. My God is on His throne. My God is in control. My God is watching over me. My God is listening to me. My God is working things out for good for me. Greatly comforts me to know that. Charles Spurgeon said, when you go through the trials of life, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head. I believe that. I believe that the sovereignty of God is a pillow for us. I believe it is rest and comfort and peace for us. It is the peace that passeth understanding. To know that when I'm anxious, I simply bring my concerns to Him. I leave them with Him, and knowing that He can handle them. And then I can be at peace because of the sovereignty of God. Oh, it's so comforting to me. But you know, it isn't comforting to everyone. In fact, some are very troubled by the sovereignty of God. Those that are not children of God, they don't tend to like the sovereignty of God. They don't like somebody being over them. They don't like someone to whom one day they're going to have to answer. They don't like that thought, and I don't blame them for not liking that thought, because if they acknowledge that God is there and that God is sovereign, then they're acknowledging the fact that they better listen to Him and obey Him or pay the consequences of not doing that. You know, it's amazing to me. They don't want God being in charge of them, but they want to be in charge of God. Let me explain what I mean by that. Imagine somebody walking into your house and saying something like this: I don't like the color you painted your walls. Or somebody coming in and saying, you know, I don't like the way that you've arranged your furniture. That didn't make sense to me. You know, I don't like where your bedrooms are located. I mean, that's not conducive to getting good rest or good sleep. You just laid this out all wrong. I don't know what you would say. You may be nicer than I am, probably are nicer than I am. But you know what I would be tempted to say? When you start paying the mortgage, when you start paying the utilities, when you start paying all the bills that are generated in this house, then you can tell me how it ought to be done. You can tell me how it ought to be laid out and what color it ought to be and all of that. But until you do that, you think what you want to think, but you don't tell me you don't like it. But we walk into God's house and we say to God, God, I don't understand this. God, why did you do it this way? God, why can't women lead? God, why can't we have a piano? God, why can't we do this or why can't we do that? How do you think God feels? Who do you think you are? When you make a world, and when you fill that world, and when you keep that world in orbit every day, and when you take care of everybody in that world, then you can tell me how to do things. But until you're in that position, you better not say anything, because you're not sovereign. You're not God. Think about the sovereignty of God. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong seems all so strong, God is the ruler yet. God is the ruler, and God's reigning upon His throne. And that brings great comfort to us, although it may trouble others. I want to read a statement to you. I found it yesterday. I was kind of going back through things and looking at things. This is by J.C. Ryle. It's a rather long statement, but I hope you'll bear with me, because I think it really captures a lot of things. It says, the Lord Jesus makes no mistakes in managing His friends' affairs. He orders all their concerns with perfect wisdom. All things happen to them at the right time and in the right way. He gives them as much of sickness and as much of health, as much of poverty and as much of riches, as much of sorrow and as much of joy as He sees their soul require. He leads them by the right way to bring them to the city of habitation. And notice this. He mixes their bitterest cups like a wise physician and takes care that they have not a drop too little or too much. His people often misunderstand His dealings. They're silly enough to fancy their course of life might have been better ordered. But in the resurrection day, they will thank God that not their will, but the will of Christ was done. God knows just what I need. God knows just what you need. He takes care of us. I believe that I have always believed in the providence, believed in the sovereignty, believed in the goodness of God. But I can tell you I believe in it more today than I ever have. Because there was a time in my life where things were pretty hard. I was pushed down and kept down. And I was thinking, how am I going to do this and how am I going to do that and how are we going to make it through this and how are we going to make it through that? God kept a roof over my head. He kept food in our mouths. He provided for me when I couldn't provide for my own. God took care of me. And I look back now and I think, you know what? Although there were many doors that were closed, God opened a door that no man could shut. God said, Wade, just trust me. Wade, just remember, I'm on my throne. I have this. I will get you to the other side of it. You can't see it. You don't know it. Just trust in my sovereignty, my providence, and my goodness. Today, my son's a preacher. I could have imagined him seeing some of the things that I've experienced over the years that he might not want to be a preacher. In fact, growing up, he said he didn't want to be one. But he is now. Sovereignty of God. One of my daughters is married. She married a good man. He's a man who preaches. He's a man who leads singing. He's a man who's going to do great things in the church. Sovereignty of God. I have a daughter that's dating a young man. He preaches. He's been on mission trips with me. Sovereignty of God. God says, don't worry about it. I have it. I can work it out. I can make it go. And He has. My youngest daughter, she's just reaching that age, but I don't worry about it. God's made a way. We sang that every day in chapel, didn't we? God will make a way for me. And God has made a way for me. He'll make a way for you. We simply have to trust in the goodness of God and believe that God will take care of us. I want you to think about an experience that I learned about. In the 1930s, Winston Churchill was trying to rise to power in Britain. He was very concerned about Hitler. He was very concerned that people were not taking Hitler seriously. They were just kind of ignoring the buildup that he was involved in. And Stanley Baldwin was the prime minister at the time. And so Winston Churchill was rather critical of him because he wasn't taking Hitler seriously. And so Winston Churchill used to go around quoting a poem, just a line from a poem. And this is the line: who's in charge of the clattering train? Who's in charge of the clattering train? Who's in charge of the clattering train? And his answer would have been, no one is. No one's paying attention. Nobody's doing anything. Sometimes in our world we look around, we say our world's a mess. Our world's going into the ditch in this way and in that way, and we say, who's in charge of this messed up world? And it may seem to us that no one's in charge. But God is on His throne. God's in charge. And God will work all things out in His good time. Let's start out by defining sovereignty. What is sovereignty? We know what a sovereign is, right? A sovereign is a ruler, a king. So we understand the idea of sovereign. Now, if you break that word apart, you have sov, S-O-V, and you have reign as the two major parts of that word. Sov means over, and reign deals with rule. And so it's over rule. It's ruling over. And so the idea is God is ruling over. God's ruling over something. Or you might even think God's overruling something because God has veto power. God has the power. When man says, I'm going to do this, God has the power to say, no, you're not. Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. We're going to build a tower. We're going to go all the way to heaven. We're going to make a name for ourselves. And God says, no, you're not. No, you're not. I'm going to confound your languages. I'm going to make it so you can't work together. I'm going to make it so you have to separate from each other. God says, you only think you're in control. I'm in control. That's the sovereignty of God. Now, as we think about the sovereignty of God and as we seek to define this idea, we would say God has the rule over what? God has the rule over blank. Choose your word. My word is everything. God has the rule over everything. God has the rule over everyone. God has the rule over the earth. God has the rule over the universe. God has the rule over the sun, moon, and stars. God has the rule over everything. Nothing not under His power. Go to Psalm chapter 22. Let's look at what the psalmist says. Now, if you want to study the sovereignty of God, I'm going to suggest to you that you study the Psalms. Because I don't think there's anyone who believed more in the sovereignty of God than David did. And I don't believe there's a book in the Bible that can bring you any more peace than this book can bring to you. Because David knew who God was. And he knew the power that God had. You know, David's running from Saul. There's just a step, David says, between me and death. How did David survive all of that time? How was David sometimes in the same cave as Saul was in? Well, because David knew Saul can't get me unless God lets him. My God is watching every step that I take. He's keeping me one step ahead of the one who wants to take a spear and stick me to the wall. He's keeping me one step ahead of him. And David trusted in God. Look at Psalm chapter 22, verse
28, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. Go to Psalm 103 and verse 19. Psalm 103 and verse 19. We're only noticing a smattering of the verses that are here. The Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. God's throne's there. He rules over everything below or beneath that. God is sovereign. Now, most sovereigns are somewhat limited. It doesn't really matter if we go back to the time where there were world-ruling empires, whether it was Egypt or whatever country it was, their territory was limited. Their time was limited. Because they reigned over a certain territory only for a certain time. Because the day was going to come when someone was going to rebel, and they weren't going to be the world-ruling empire anymore. They weren't going to be the king in charge of everything. The day was going to come when they were going to be put to death or going to die. It's a little bit the idea of Hebrews chapter 7, verses 23 through 25. Now there we're not talking about a king, we're talking about a priest. But you remember the priest? There's a point that's being made regarding Jesus there. And it said concerning the priests that they were prevented by death. Those earthly priests were prevented by death. You see, they were in this position, but eventually they were prevented from continuing in that position because of death. Now, what's the point the Hebrew writer is making about Jesus? He wasn't so limited. Death wasn't going to stop him. He was going to be a priest forever. He was going to be in that position always. Wasn't going to be an end or a limitation placed on him that was placed on others. Let's talk about the sovereignty of God declared. We can't notice all the verses, but we can notice a few verses. Genesis 18 and verse 25 is one of my favorites. It's Abraham, and Abraham says, "Shall not the God of all the earth do right?" The God of what? The God of all the earth. Abraham had a view of God, not a limited view of God. He says, the God of all the earth. Abraham knew who God was. He knew his sovereignty. Now Abraham's pleading with God. He's looking at Sodom and Gomorrah and looking at Lot and his family. He's concerned about them. He's going to bargain with God, but he's convinced that the judge who rules over all the earth is going to do right. I'm convinced of that. You're convinced of that. God is sovereign over all the earth, and he's going to do what's right. Go to Psalm chapter 83. Let's notice another verse that deals with God's sovereignty. Really the whole psalm, I'm going to point out just a few verses. Look at verse 4. They have said, here's the enemy, they have said, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation." They're after God's people. They're going to destroy them from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gibeah, Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria also has joined with them. They have helped the children of God. These are some of God's enemies in the Old Testament. Enemies of God's people. Strong, powerful enemies. But look at verse 18. He's pleading with them. In verse 17 we'll begin. "Let them be confounded and dismayed forever. Yes, let them be put to shame and perish, that they may know that you, whose name alone is the Lord, are the Most High over all the earth." God, remind them of who you are. God, they're after your people. God, you remind them of your position and how that you are the Most High over all the earth. God, show them who you are. I think maybe we would like for God to do that sometimes today as well, to show who he is and that we are his people. Do you know the name Michael Bloomberg? He was at one time the mayor of New York. And he was interviewed by the New York Times. And in that interview, they were talking to him, and he was talking about all the things that he had accomplished. And he was talking about what he had accomplished relative to guns, and what he had accomplished relative to obesity, and what he had accomplished relative to smoking and tobacco. And he was touting those accomplishments. And then he brought up the judgment of God. And he said he was confident as he faced the judgment of God. He said, if there is a God, when I enter into heaven, I'm not going to stop to be interviewed. I'm just going to go right in because I have earned it, and it isn't even close. Wow. I'm not going to stop to be interviewed. No, but you're going to stop to do something else. You're going to stop and you're going to hit your knees and you're going to begin to confess that God is and that His Son is, and you're going to confess all those things that you denied and ignored and rebelled against. You're going to submit to now because God is sovereign. You haven't earned it. None of us can. Oh, it's true, it's not even close. But it's not even close that any of us deserve to get to go there or to be there. It's by God's grace if we get to be there. Don't be like Michael Bloomberg. Think about what Paul said, 1 Timothy chapter 6. I like these verses, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 13 through 16. Paul's speaking of Jesus, and he says, the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and the Lord of lords. The blessed and only potentate. He's the only king. He's the King of kings. He's the Lord of lords. That's the position He's in. The Bible declares His sovereignty. The day is coming when all nations are going to be gathered before Him, and He's going to stand in judgment of them. Every single nation on earth, every tongue is going to stand there and be judged by Him. Why? Because He is sovereign. He is in charge. Notice with me Psalm chapter 115 in verse 3. Psalm chapter 115 in verse 3. We're staying in the Psalms. I told you we would do a lot of that just because I think the Psalms really have a lot to say about God's sovereignty, about God's position and reign over all the earth. But our God is in heaven. He does whatever He pleases. God's in heaven. He does whatever He wants to do. You can't stop Him. I can't stop Him. Every force on earth can't stop Him. He does what He pleases. He does what He wants to. I love that situation in the Old Testament where there's one of the kings that's trying to come in and capture God's prophet. And he surrounds the city of Samaria, and he thinks, I finally have him. But he's surrounded by the angels of heaven in their chariots in the mountains. And the king gets very angry. And the king wants to know, which one of my servants is tipping them off? Which one of my servants is listening to what I say in my bedchamber and then running a message over there to them? And his servant says, it's none of us. It's the prophet of God. You imagine trying to sneak up on God? I'm going to sneak up on Him. He's everywhere. He knows everything, and He can do anything. You tell me how you're going to beat Him. You tell me how you're going to overcome Him. You're facing a losing battle if you're fighting against God, because God is sovereign, and He will prove Himself to be so. Go to Psalm 135. Psalm 135. I want you to look at this, and then we'll move ahead. Psalm 135 is again talking about the sovereignty of God and just declaring it in very simple terms. Beginning in verse 6, verse 5, he says, For I know that the Lord is great, and our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, He does, in heaven and in earth, in the seas and in all the deep places. He said, you just name the place, and God does what He wants to there. God stilled storms. God walked on the water. God caused a fish to have a coin in his mouth and to get caught on a hook so taxes could be paid. You tell me my God isn't sovereign? Aquaman can't do that. Aquaman can't call that fish and get that accomplished, but my God did. He did that in every aspect of creation. Why? Because He made it all. He reigns over it all. It all obeys His voice. Man is the one that rebels against Him. But notice something else from Psalm 135. Let me give you an example. I love this example. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 11 through 18, We're reading about Eli. Now, Eli's not one of my favorite characters. Eli was a weak man in many ways, and remember, God's going to judge his house because he knew that his sons were doing the wrong thing, and he didn't do anything about that. And so God speaks to Samuel in the night, and he tells Samuel, listen, the ears of the people are going to tingle with what's about to happen to Eli's house. Well, the next morning, Eli wants to know, what did the Lord tell you? And Samuel doesn't want to tell him because it's bad news, not good news, and he doesn't want to be the one to tell Eli what's going to happen to his house, and there's not going to be any pardon or forgiveness forever. But Eli says, you need to tell me. And Samuel tells him. And I love what Eli says. It is the Lord. Let him do as seems good to him. Eli, this man that seemed to have so little control in his life, so little control over his sons, he said, Samuel, this is God's voice. This is what God has said. I recognize who God is. I recognize that God is sovereign. You let God do what God wants to do. You let God do as seems good to him, Eli says, even if that doesn't mean good for me. Let God be God. I like Eli's position there. He seems to have returned a little bit from where he had gone. Go to Job chapter 9. Very quickly, Job chapter 9. I know it doesn't seem like we're getting very far, but we're going to. We're just now warming up. Job chapter 9. I want you to look at these verses with me. This is Job. Job says in verse 3, if one wished to contend with him, he could not answer him one time out of 1,000. Now, this is Job early in the book. What's going to happen later in the book? Job's going to face some questions. And what Job says here in theory, Job's going to face in reality. And Job's going to figure out, I should have put my hand over my mouth. I'm not going to speak anymore because I shouldn't have been speaking. Because I thought I wanted an audience with you. I thought I wanted to tell you some things. And Job said, boy, I was wrong. He says in verse 4, God is wise in heart, mighty in strength, who has hardened himself against him and prospered. You tell me, who has ever stood up against God, and they're the ones standing at the end? Oh, no. You don't challenge God and come out the other side. Verse 7, he commands the sun, and it does not rise. You tell me another king on earth that can tell the sun not to come up tomorrow. He has no power over that. But our God does. He seals off the stars. Imagine that you're going to try to keep the stars from shining. You don't have a blanket big enough to do that. You don't have a cover or a shield big enough to block out the stars of heaven. They're going to shine whether you want them to shine or not. But God can put a blanket over them where you don't see them at all. Only God can do that. God is sovereign. Notice verse 10. He does great things past finding out, yes, wonders without number. If he goes by me, I do not see him. If he moves past, I do not perceive him. If he takes away, who can hinder him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God will not withdraw his anger. The allies of the proud will lie prostrate beneath him. Job says, my God is sovereign. My God is in charge. Now let's talk about the sovereignty of God displayed. And that gets displayed with a number of individuals throughout the Bible. But where I think it's displayed the clearest is with other sovereigns, with others that are in positions of authority. God seems to flex his muscle when he's dealing with other rulers on earth who think that they're in charge. Pharaoh, Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2. Remember what Pharaoh said when Moses came in? Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Do you not know who I am? I am the representative of the Son God. I am the representative of Ra on the earth. Who is the Lord that I need to obey him? Well, he was about to learn who the Lord was. and he was about to learn why he should have obeyed him. Egypt was going to be brought to its knees. Pharaoh was going to get up in the middle of the night to find that his son had been taken, and he's going to say, leave now. Get out of here. He can't take anymore. God has broken him. Now he says, in a few days or some time, I'm going after them. I'm going to get them back. And God says, no, you're not. They're walking through the sea. Who parted that water? Well, God did. God controls the seas, the deep. He controls it. They're crossing. So Pharaoh says, well, if they can cross, I can cross. Here he comes. How'd that work out? Pharaoh comes out the other side, circles around the Israelites, and says, we're going back. No. Pharaoh never came out. He went in, but he didn't come out. God brought the waters down upon him, and Egypt never was the same again. Think about Romans chapter 9, verses 14 through 18. I know Romans 9 is a hard chapter, but this point's pretty simple. God says, I raised up Pharaoh so that I could show my power in him. God said, I wanted you to see that the most powerful ruler on earth, was nothing in my presence. He was nothing in standing against me. What about Sennacherib? In 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 28 through 37, he sends his servant over to give warning to Jerusalem, and he's telling them, don't listen to Hezekiah. Don't let him deceive you. Don't let him convince you to trust in God, because I went against this city and this city and this city and this city. I went against all their gods, and their gods were more powerful than what I think your God is, and not a one of them are around anymore. I destroyed every one of them, and I'm going to do the same thing to you. Isaiah 37, God says, he will not shoot an arrow there. He won't get an arrow over the wall, God says. $185,000 dead. The king returns home. He goes into the house of his God, and his own sons murder him there. Don't tell God what you're going to do to him, because God can keep you from even getting an arrow off. God can keep the archer from ever letting go of that arrow, and he did. God is sovereign. Think about another example that we think about from the Scriptures. What about Daniel chapter 4? What about Nebuchadnezzar? Remember Nebuchadnezzar says, look at Babylon, look at what I built with my power. And God's going to take away his sanity. He's going to go out and he's going to graze like an ox. He's going to go out and his hair is going to grow like eagle's feathers. His fingernails are going to grow like bird's claws. And he wouldn't have had a kingdom to come back to if God had not kept it while he was away. But when he comes back, God has been giving him a message. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. He's able to abase those who lift themselves up in pride. He's able to bring them down. Nebuchadnezzar's a different man when he comes out of this, because Nebuchadnezzar knows that God is sovereign. He knows that God is in charge. Let's do one more thing, and the lesson's yours. And that is sovereignty discussed. Now, this is where it gets difficult. Because if God is sovereign, and we've seen that he is, and if man has free will, and we know that he does, then how does the sovereignty of God work with the free will of man? If God's sovereign, why does man need free will? If man has free will, then how is God sovereign? How does that work? That's difficult to comprehend, how that works. Let me give you an example. Go to Esther chapter 4. I'll give you one example of how that works. You remember that a decree has been made that all the Jews are going to be killed on a certain day. That decree's already been signed. You can't do anything about that decree as far as getting it to go away. And so Mordecai is pleading with Esther. She's got to go in and intercede on behalf of her people because she has a relationship with the king, or at least in the past has had one. Verse 13, Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Let me show you the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. God in His sovereignty has already made the decision the Jews are going to survive. They're going to stay around because my Son is going to come into the world and He's going to come through them, and so they've got to stay around. So God's already made His decision. He's already made His purpose. That's what's going to happen. Now Esther has free will. Esther can be used by God to help to deliver these people, or she can choose not to. That's her choice. God's not forcing her one way or the other way. If she chooses to, she might save her people as well as herself. Chooses not to, not going to stop the purpose of God, is not going to keep God from accomplishing what He wants to accomplish. He's just going to do it through somebody else. Mordecai, he gets it. He understands the sovereignty of God. He understands the free will of man. I was teaching this week, and I noticed a couple of verses that stood out to me. Go to Isaiah chapter 63 and verse 5. Isaiah 63 and verse 5. I love this. I'd never seen this before. You remember that Ezekiel said, or God said through Ezekiel, that He sought for a man who would stand in the gap, who would make up the hedge before Him. But God says, I didn't find anyone. I couldn't find anyone to do that. Well, look at Isaiah 63 and verse 5, and look at what God says. And it involves the sovereignty of God as well as the free will of man. Verse 5, He says, I looked, but there was no one to help, and I wondered that there was no one to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation for me, and my own fury, it sustained me. God said, I was looking for someone, and I didn't find anybody, but I still did what I purposed to do. Man doesn't stop God from doing what God purposes to do. God wants to work through men. God looks for men through whom He can work. We don't stop God. We don't stop God's purposes. God's purposes are ultimately going to be fulfilled. We don't understand all of it. We don't know how all of it's done. We know we're not in the age of miracles. We're not saying that God does something of that nature today, but we are saying that God's will be performed. James chapter 4. Talk about prayer. We have the free will to pray. God has said, you have not because of what? Because you ask not. Here's God who's sovereign. God can give what He wants, do what He wants, but God says, I'm not going to give you until you ask. Your free will is involved in that. Somebody has compared it to this, and I think it's a good illustration of this. A mom has a sick child. The child goes to bed. The mom's already made up her mind. If that child is sick in the night, I'll get up with that child. If that child's sick in the night, I'll do whatever that child needs me to do. I'm determined to do that. But what if that child goes to bed and they never call out in the night? They never wake up in the night. They never cry out. What does that mom do? Oh, she's there. She's ready to do anything if she hears the smallest cry. But she waits until that child cries before she goes in there to solve whatever that problem is. God says, I'm ready. Every blessing I have, my storehouse is full. I'm just waiting for my children to call out, and I'll give you how many blessings do we go without? Not because our God isn't powerful enough, or not because our God can't do something, but because we in our free will never align ourselves with what His ultimate purpose is, and that is to give us all things that we could ever desire. He's able to do exceedingly, abundantly, above all that we ask or think. I'm not thinking big enough. I'm not asking great enough, because my God is sovereign, and He rules over the earth, and He owns everything, and He can give me whatever I need to accomplish His purpose. I need to trust in the sovereignty of my God. God is sovereign over the nations. One day, when that final trump is sounded and everyone is gathered before God, there's not a person who's ever lived who will question the sovereignty of God. Everyone will be on the same page with who He is and what power He has. My question is, why not submit to that sovereignty now so that you enjoy the blessings of being the child of the King of kings and the Lord of lords, so that you're in His kingdom. He rules over all the earth. You're in His kingdom. He has everything. He can give you everything you need. He can listen to everything you say. He can protect you from everything that comes your way. You can go to sleep at night knowing that your God is reigning over you, and knowing that not one thing can ever happen to you that's outside of His control. He's in control. Thank you very much for your attention.